West Edmonton Mall's Fantasyland amusement park opened in 1983. And though it was already the world's largest indoor facility of its type, it quickly expanded in the following 3 years. In 1986, the park's Phase 2 expansion was unveiled through its grand opening.
The crowd rushed for the rides to get their thrills and chills.
Early concept art showing a continuation of the fantasy theme was delivered upon in most areas, with much of the decor, attractions, and rides existing as they were originally envisioned. The track of the train ride, originally opened 2 years earlier in the park's initial grand opening, was extended to the new area of the park, traveling around the impressive new water feature in the middle of the area. A new water feature which included a boat ride, where riders were pulled along a set path around the lake. And newer, more extreme rides were added as well, where the 1983 opening of the park saw a mainly children-focused collection of rides.
What I do wonder, though, is how they cleaned all of those balls at the end of the night. What do you do then? That's a side note.
This new addition finally gave the older, more thrill-hungry audience something to satisfy their hunger. The Disco Dynamo spun riders at faster speeds than anything else in the park, at least up until that time anyway. And those looking for an even more thrilling experience would be flipped on their heads, quite literally, when riding the Perilous Pendulum. But as with virtually all concepts, some gaps did exist with the vision that came into realization, most glaringly the surrounding cast iron architecture, and of which the intended separation wall that was meant to be built. The function of this envisioned barrier was to separate the fantasy theme, which itself was a continuation from the park's original opening, from a completely different theme, one which would also arrive along with the expansion of Fantasyland. Well, at least as far as the concept drawings were concerned anyway. The master plan, which portrayed the layout of the fantasy theme expansion of the park, also showed an ambitious vision for the area with the most extreme rides within Fantasyland, an outer space galactic experience. Initially planned to be laid out over multiple levels, the area was portrayed to exist within a maze-like atmosphere. Robotic, space-themed exhibits and games would entertain guests as they made their way along the main level concourse, with additional interactive attractions existing on the level below. The level below, which would be accessible via space-age turbolifts, or, as they're commonly known, elevators. And the elevators would also take guests upwards to viewing areas, or perhaps even to further attractions. But the area's elevators, as futuristic as they were meant to look, were not going to be the most impressive way to traverse the different levels of this new space-themed area. No, that honor went to the proposed transporter platform. Clear tubes would hold 1 or 2 people, and their so-called transporter would lift and lower them between main and lower levels. The area would also feature a wide array of shooting gallery attractions. Players would sit in cockpit-style chairs and take aim at either virtual or physical targets. It's hard to tell from the renderings, but these shooting attractions were not to exist strictly as stationary installments. In fact, one of the largest footprint attractions was going to be the shooting gallery ride. After being seated in the concourse-adjacent amphitheater, players would be briefed about their upcoming experience. It seems that the blasters would be controlled via 2 levers, and players would aim at a variety of targets. Players would then board the ride, which by all indications would rotate in a circular motion while player positions would pivot to aim their blasters. And this shooting gallery ride, along with everything we've discussed thus far, were all planned to sit below the area's most intense and iconic attraction, an extreme, full-fledged looping roller coaster, titled, at the time, as the Super Double Looping Boomerang Coaster, even though, according to the very plans the name was listed on, it was said to consist of 3 loops. As well, a couple of helix sections, and even a section of track which would curve out through the wall into the fantasy-themed section of the expansion. As if the concept of these attractions were not impressive enough in themselves, the space-themed area of Fantasyland was slated to be home to another, certainly ambitious-looking ride. Located just behind the transporters we mentioned earlier, these floating balls were an interpretation of a ride in which players would fly within a space-themed capsule. Powerful air compressors would lift these pods out of their tubes, and riders would spin and rotate their pods with essentially limitless control. Perhaps what is most intriguing about this proposed concept was the extent of the styling and the outer space theme. Most all of the rides, along with the multi-level concourse, would exist inside a stylized spaceport with overhead windows looking out into a star-filled sky. The only ride outside of the port would be the roller coaster, which was set to exist nearly entirely above the concourse in this area. It was going to share its space with the final notable attraction included in the concept. Sitting high above the concourse in a Jetson-style building, surrounded by stars, was a stylized observational space tower. This structure was meant to house the nightlife of the mall, the Fantasyland nightclub. As impressive as the outer space theming was to look, as ambitious as the multi-level concourse was to exist, and as exciting as the rides were to be, this area suffered greatly from the lost in translation syndrome which often exists between concept and realization. Far more so than the loss experienced in the fantasy-themed area right next door. Next door, where lakes and water rides, mountains and massive slides all found a way to exist in at least some semblance of what their concept imagined. But no, the proposed space theme area was sadly not meant to be. At least not back then, and certainly not like that. When Phase 2 of Fantasyland opened its doors in the grand opening of 1986, there was no overarching space theme included. There were no walls to separate the planned space section from the fantasy section because there was no space section. And the extent to which the absence of concept elements existed was not limited to theme alone. The area didn't feature anything close to the concourse which was originally imagined. The multi-level experience, which pitched futuristic games and robotic exhibits, had become nothing more than, well, fantasy. That's not to say that the entire concept was thrown away, as what did exist in that area bears at least some semblance to limited aspects from the original concept art. The roller coaster, which was present in the imagined space, was indeed built, and it was built to a far more impressive scale. The height and length of the track was well beyond what would have existed had the concept version been strictly adhered to.
The Mindbender, the first indoor roller coaster I had ever seen and rode. I had already been on other looping roller coasters starting in 1977, the Revolution at Magic Mountain, and lots of wooden roller coasters at Darien Lake in New York, Cedar Point in Ohio, and Canada's Wonderland in Ontario. But the Mindbender was different, beginning with the horn blast at the start, and no chain or ratchet noise on the long climb to the top. Very, very unusual. And still cannot really be compared with anything else to date. The experience is really that unique, especially riding backwards in the rear car. And I've got this poster placemat from my first trip to Fantasyland in 1987.
Fantasyland's Mindbender was the world's tallest indoor roller coaster, and riders experienced more G-force on it than all but one other roller coaster in all of North America. The scale and intensity of what became Fantasyland's most intense and iconic ride was truly one of a kind. And though, as mentioned, no real concourse area existed below the roller coaster, a walkway does travel through one of its 3 loops. This not only welcomed visitors into the park from outside, but also acted as a path to another of the limited attractions which remained true to concept, Astro Base Alpha. Players sat in molded seats upon a large circular platform, similar to that of a tilt-a-wheel. Grouped in pairs, each rider would control a so-called laser blaster. As the platform began to rotate and their seats spun in place, players would take aim at targets on the dome ceiling, shooting them to try to achieve the highest score possible. Astro Base Alpha was one of only 2 rides to exist within the footprint of the Mindbender. The other was the Orbitron. Manufactured by the same company who developed the Swing of the Century, this ride took passengers on quite the trip. Cars would travel in a vertical rotation on the end of a so-called spoke, which itself was traveling around the center of the ride in a horizontal motion. And here's a fun fact. When the expansion was being announced, the custom Fantasyland names for the Orbitron and the Perilous Pendulum weren't yet decided upon. So the park hung banners and ran advertisements using their generic names, the Fireball and the Looping Starship. Because this new area's layout didn't have to account for constraints associated with framing it within a galactic-themed space station, there was some freedom to expand regarding additional ride ambitions. Namely, bringing the world's tallest indoor drop ride to the park.
The infamous Drop of Doom, which made your stomach feel like it was in your neck after the buzzer sounded. And I got the shirt on that right now.
It was a first-generation Intamin drop ride and seemed so much less sophisticated than today's drop rides. Just the way it was a little bit rickety, and it felt a whole lot more metallic. Something about it felt just a little bit unsafe, the way your cage was hauled up to the top. And then as you wait those few seconds before it's let loose, you're really wondering what you've gotten yourself into. The other thing that I thought was more exciting about the giant drop was the way it had that long run out. So the track would actually curve and the car that you were in would end up coasting along on its back. So you're lying fully backwards and you got a bit more of a ride experience as you came to a stop.
Riders would experience an over 11-story freefall from the ceiling of the park, which is remarkably high. Though, not as high as it would have needed to have been in order to facilitate that space station version of the nightclub. Building an atmospheric space exterior around that seemingly huge nightclub would have required a massive amount of, space. So when the nightclub component of this expansion was realized, it was a completely different implementation. Behind an unthemed set of windows lived one of the earliest nightlife spots at West Edmonton Mall, the Fantasyland nightclub. Back down in the park, the expansion also brought a rare permanent installment of Chance Ride's Zipper. A fan favorite at traveling carnivals and fairs around the world, its unique flipping, rising, and dropping action qualified it to be named by popular mechanics as one of the world's strangest rides. Finally, there was one additional ride from the concept which, at least in part, was attempted as per the original vision for this area of the park, even if the concept representation was greatly exaggerated. The Saker 1 space probe. The park, however, secured only a single orb, not quite the collection that was once envisioned. The original concept for this ride was that it would not only float and rotate on air from within the tube below, but it would have a screen and a control stick. This would enable players to compete in a video game-style space battle. However, since they only had one, a head-to-head battle wasn't really possible. In fact, they never implemented the video game aspect of this attraction. Riders merely sat in the orb, and the blower would bob the pod up and down in place. It was reportedly a somewhat enjoyable ride, with the thrill coming from the fear that one sphere might fly out of the tube altogether, though, because of physics, that wasn't really a possibility. When looking back at what could have been, one can't help but to wonder what a real, honest-to-goodness attempt at this space-themed area would have been like. It's not difficult to see why the idea of a separate themed area would have been floated about. Disneyland had seen tremendous success with their themed areas. And really, it's apparent that Disneyland was on the mind of them all by the time this second phase opened.
Disneyland, eat your heart out!
That was Nader Gurmezian's battle cry as he spoke at the official opening of Canada Fantasyland. It's the latest in a series of attractions the 555 Corporation has opened as part of West Edmonton Mall.
And even though the outer space styling of Fantasyland's Phase 2 was not realized, the expansion did end up delivering one of the world's most extreme coasters, and the world's tallest indoor drop. Still, years down the road, those with a fondness for the park would see the fantasy fade, replaced by a theme which we now know was conceived a full decade before. So, while the park's expansion brought iconic new rides and a boatload of new thrills, one can't help but to wonder what it might have been like. And the next time you remember what once was, stop and imagine what could have been. Imagine the stars and the space station nightclub. Imagine the shooting galleries and the futuristic transporter. Imagine the array of different levels to explore. Imagine the hovering pods, as far-fetched as they were, and the space-themed games and exhibits. Imagine a separation from the world of fantasy by stepping through a gateway into a fully enclosed outer space experience. Imagine what could have been in the second phase of West Edmonton Mall's Fantasyland.